Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. This is God's word. Well, maybe you heard it in there. 3 times the word justice came up. And I wonder if your ears perked up a little bit when you heard that. I know it caught my attention when I first read through this because justice is kind of a hot button issue in our society. There are all kinds of people who have all kinds of opinions on justice, whether the justice system that we have is broken, how broken it is, how to fix the brokenness in our justice system. There are people who want to talk about the injustices they see in the world. Maybe you think about all of the civilians who are caught in the crossfire in Ukraine during Russia's invasion. There are people who want to talk about the racial tensions in our world, the racial injustice that they see, this tension that's been bubbling beneath the surface for decades and has now just erupted recently. There are people all over the place who want to talk about all kinds of different matters related to the subject of justice. Political campaigns are won and lost on this issue. There are talk show hosts who debate how we're doing at trying to administer justice in our world. There are social activists who are trying to point our attention to injustices that they see. And while this is obviously a divisive issue, right? An issue that a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on. While we may disagree about the political issues involved, while we may disagree about how to legislate this, what we all want is justice, right? We all want that. Nobody is running a political campaign on an anti-justice platform, right? Nobody's saying, I'm against justice. We all want to live in a fair and equitable society. Justice is something that we all want, and that's why it's such a hot button issue in our society. And it was the same in Isaiah's day. Justice was something that was talked about a lot. Actually, if you read the Old Testament, you see it all over the place. You see God calling out the Israelites and other nations for the injustices in their countries. You had people who were underprivileged and were being oppressed by the rich and powerful. You had people going hungry while other people had plenty of food. You had people that were being forgotten and overlooked. You had all kinds of injustices going on. And so this was a popular topic. This was something that they were dealing with just as much as we are. And so they had to look somewhere for help. They had to look somewhere for hope. And in Isaiah 41, the chapter before what we just read, you see where they turned. God talks about it. He says that they have turned to idols made of wood and stone. And the very last verse of chapter 41, right before what we read today, God gives the verdict on those idols and how much they're worth. He says, "See, they, the idols, are all false. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are but wind and confusion." But then chapter 42 starts, and God unveils his chosen one who's going to bring justice to the nations. That's what it says. 3 times in there it says that his chosen one is going to bring justice to the nations, not just to Israel, but to the whole world. That last line of our text, in his teaching, the islands will put their hope. The islands in Isaiah are symbolic for other nations besides Israel. And so he's saying not just in Israel, but throughout the whole world, someone is going to come who's going to establish justice. But maybe you noticed that in this reading, this servant, this person, God's chosen one, is defined more by what he doesn't do than by what he does do. Do you notice that? It comes up over and over again, the things he won't do. Isaiah says he will not He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or snuff out a smoldering wick. And he will not falter or become discouraged. These are the defining qualities of this servant. This is what sets him apart from anyone else who comes into this world trying to establish justice. And that's what we're going to see today. We're going to see that this justice is a different kind of justice than we're accustomed to. This is a gentle kind of justice that God's servant comes to bring. And so we're going to look at the three things that God's servant will not do, and we're going to see what those mean for us. So first of all, Isaiah tells us that he will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. If you heard today that there was someone whose mission on earth was to completely wipe out injustice on the face of the earth, to bring justice to the world, what would you expect that person to be like? What kind of things would you expect that person to do? I think it would be natural for us to assume that a person who came to establish justice in the world would be a dynamic speaker. They would gather crowds of people, thousands of people, to hear their speeches. They would organize rallies. Maybe they'd organize a march on Washington or marches in big cities to draw attention to their cause. They would be active on social media, right? They'd be trying to get as many followers as possible to try and get their message out there, to show the injustices that are happening and to try to get people to do something about them. You'd expect them to speak with tenacity against the injustices they see in the world, maybe even with a little bit of vengeance. You'd expect them to attack the people who are committing these acts of violence and oppression. You would expect them to look for vengeance and punishment for these people who are committing injustice in the world. That's what we would expect, but Isaiah gives us a description that's almost completely the opposite. He starts out by saying, right when you think he's about to say, "Behold your king who comes to establish justice," he says, "Behold my servant." So he starts off by saying that this person, this chosen one who's coming into the world, is not going to be someone who exercises political authority. He's not going to hold some office in the government. He's going to come as a humble servant. He's not going to shout out and cry out in the streets. He's not going to try to gather as much attention to himself as possible. And as Jesus comes into the world, you see that, right? He's not born in a palace. He's born in a stable. He doesn't try to get as many people to see his great speeches and his miraculous deeds as he can. In fact, a lot of times he tells people not to spread the word about what they saw. Even on the day of probably his most earthly fame, Palm Sunday, what you see is not Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a white horse, trying to draw as much attention to himself as possible. You see him riding on a donkey. In fact, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So you can picture Jesus riding this baby donkey. His feet are probably almost dragging along the ground. It's not the image of a powerful king, it's the image of a servant. Yes, Jesus is our conquering king who comes to defeat death. He is the king who rules over the world, but he's also a humble servant who didn't use this fame that he gained on Palm Sunday to organize a revolt against the Roman government that occupied Jerusalem. He didn't use it to take that momentum and to try to set himself up as king to hold political authority over people. Instead, he rode into Jerusalem humbly as our servant who came to establish justice. And the way he came to do that, Isaiah says, is not by breaking bruised reeds and snuffing out smoldering wicks. And so what he means by that is he's going to establish justice, but he's going to do it in a different way than most people are accustomed to. He's not going to establish justice by using violence. He's not going to trample over people to get to his goal. He's not going to meet oppression with more oppression or try to establish justice with acts of injustice. He's going to establish justice, but he's going to do it gently. He's going to do it without breaking bruised reeds and snuffing out smoldering wicks. And I think that might be a little bit of a foreign concept for us, this idea of gentle justice. See, when we see acts of injustice in the world, we don't want gentle justice. We want those people to pay. And we want vengeance that's going to be harsh and that's going to be swift. We want to see them suffer, right? It's the same thing when someone hurts us in our own life, in our personal life. If someone does something to hurt us, our first thought is not, how can I deal with this person gently? Right? Our first thought is, how can I make this person wish they were never born, to pay them back for what they did to me? Or when you see a Christian commit some sin, stumble in their faith, our first thought is not, how can I extend the love and the mercy of Christ to this person? So often, our first thought is to judge them, to say, how can they call themselves a Christian when they're doing something like that? Instead of binding up a person who's struggling the same way that we often struggle in our faith, our first reaction is to crush them with our judgment, to snuff out the smoldering wick of their faith. See, what happens so often when we try to administer justice, our attempts at administering justice end up breaking bruised reeds and snuffing out smoldering wicks. We think that we're establishing justice in the earth. We think we're doing something good, but what we're actually doing is we're perverting justice. We're putting ourselves on the wrong side of God's justice. Because God's justice is a higher standard than ours is. God's justice is not just about taking care of the most egregious acts of violence and oppression. It's not just about fighting against racism or murder or war crimes. God's justice includes those things for sure, but it's also concerned with the sense of pride that we often have when we're trying to administer justice on someone else. It's also concerned about the self-righteous thoughts that hide in our hearts as we're judging someone else for their lack of faith or for their sins. It's concerned about the thoughts and attitudes of our hearts that might not make the front page of the news, but are equally offensive in God's sight. See, what we don't like to admit, and what's frankly a little bit terrifying when we think about this idea of justice, is that when it comes to God's justice, every one of us is on the wrong side of it. But that's why God sent his servant. See, this prophecy it's what we call a typological prophecy, or typological, however you want to pronounce it. But what it means is this. It means that it has two fulfillments. One is an intended fulfillment, and the other one is the ultimate fulfillment. And so the intended fulfillment of this prophecy is actually the nation of Israel. God chose the people of Israel, and his idea was that they would be a beacon of God's justice to the nations. That was his intent. And that's why, if you've ever wondered why the Old Testament Israelites had so many laws, so many of those laws that we see and kind of think are kind of out there in Leviticus and stuff like that, that's why. When God established his law on Mount Sinai, he put into place the most generous justice system that the world had seen to that point. He put into place a justice system that had provisions for widows and foreigners, for people who were often overlooked or oppressed in ancient societies. He had provisions that protected the rights of women, which was unheard of in that time. He had the most basic, or the most generous human rights system in his justice system that was better than anything in the ancient Near East, and that is really the basis for human rights all the way up to today. That's why God put all those laws into place, because he wanted the Israelites to be a beacon of God's justice in the world. He wanted other nations to see the way Israelites treated each other and to say, man, I want to know about that God who put that system into place. That was the purpose, that they could be the beacon of God's justice for the nations. But what happened instead was the Israelites treated each other with just as much violence and hatred and injustice, time and time again, as any of the other nations. The Israelites, just like we often do when we try to administer justice, they came up short. So God sent another servant. He sent the ultimate servant, the one who would fill in the shortcomings of Israel. He would be the perfect substitute for what Israel was lacking. He would establish justice on the earth. A servant who would establish justice while at the same time winning our justification. See, that's what Jesus came to do. But in order for Jesus to establish justice on the earth, the first thing that had to happen was that every unjust action, every hateful deed, every prideful thought, every sin that was ever committed, it had to be punished. God couldn't just let those things go. If he did, he wouldn't be just. He wouldn't be establishing justice. He'd be letting injustice go unpunished. So he sent his servant, his chosen one, to ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, knowing full well what he was getting into, knowing full well that he was going into Jerusalem to be crucified 5 days later. And as Jesus was crucified on that cross, as he was put to death on that cross, he was not just facing the pain and the suffering of crucifixion. He was not just suffering the pain of having his hands nailed and being beaten and whipped. He was actually suffering the pain of hell that humanity's sins deserved. That's what happened on Good Friday, that Jesus went to the cross. He went to the cross to establish God's justice and to win justification for sinful human beings like you and me. And yet, knowing what was ahead of him, he still never faltered or got discouraged. That's the last thing that Isaiah tells us about this servant. What often stops us when we're trying to administer justice, or when we're trying to show people grace and mercy, what often stops us is, well, number one, it's just really hard to show people grace, right? To forgive people who have wronged us. Number two, we get discouraged when we see how much injustice is still out there, right? And yet, God didn't let that stop him. He knew that the people he showed grace to were going to go out and take advantage of other people. He knew that the people that he forgave were going to go out and use that forgiveness as a license to sin. He knew that people like you and me, who had been shown such radical, generous justice, who had been shown such overwhelming love, were going to go out and treat it as if they had never been forgiven. They were going to treat other people harshly. He knew that the people standing there on Palm Sunday crying out, "Hosanna, Lord save us," some of them would be the same people calling for his unjust execution on Good Friday morning. And yet, he didn't let any of that get in his way. With unwavering determination, he rode into Jerusalem that day, knowing that he was facing not a coronation as king, but an execution as a criminal. Because that was the only way that he could establish justice while at the same time winning our justification. So he rode into Jerusalem humbly, not shouting or crying out, not raising his voice in the streets, but administering this gentle justice that the world had never before seen, showing unwavering determination as he went into Jerusalem that day. And it's his unwavering determination that now enables us to go out and to establish this kind of gentle, generous, kind, grace-filled justice in the world. It's this spirit that was on Jesus and that is now in us through faith that allows us to show grace to the people in our lives, that allows us to forgive those who have wronged us, that allows us to extend mercy to people who are struggling in their faith. By his grace and with his Spirit, we can be beacons of justice in this world. Not the harsh, violent, vengeful justice that we so often want, but the gentle, generous justice that Jesus came to bring. A gentle justice that doesn't try to establish justice through injustice or fight oppression with more oppression, but a justice that binds up bruised reeds and fans smoldering wicks into flame. When we show that kind of justice to people, when we treat people with that much grace, we won't have to shout out or cry out or raise our voices in the streets, because that kind of justice will be a light shining in a dark place. People will be drawn to that kind of justice, and they'll want to know why we treat each other with such generosity and with such grace. So as Christians, that's what we do. While we wait for Jesus to return, while we wait for him to come at the end of the age to establish justice forever, to completely eradicate all injustice, until then, we wait by fighting for this kind of justice, fighting for this gentle, grace-filled justice in the world, and knowing that he is coming back on the last day. And when he does, we'll join in with the refrain we heard from the people on Palm Sunday this morning. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. May God grant that. Amen.